Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Safaruk Chowdhury. I'm currently a researcher at the Cambridge Muslim College, and my research subject area is analytic epistemology. So that's just looking at the theory of knowledge from the Islamic perspective, but try and apply some of the tools and machinery of the analytic tradition, the analytic philosophy tradition. That's often the philosophy that's done in the departments in America and Europe, England, America, and Europe. So they're called the Anglo-American philosophy. I have a philosophy background and a Sharia background, and so I'm really happy to be amongst everyone. And it's really been brilliant and stimulating this first session. Let me just jump straight into it, because I know this might be a bit of a challenging topic. But before I do that, let me just say I apologize for the noise in the background, because we're in the middle of a storm, so you might hear some battering on the window, but you might also hear a little storm of my son storming into the room, creating whirlwinds. But inshallah, we hope he's calm. But unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of noise in the background. So alhamdulillah, as long as everyone's safe, that's the important thing. Okay. Right, so the topic of my chapter, the topic that I went for was an easy one, a very easy one, and that's the topic of free will and divine foreknowledge. So what I wanted to do in this chapter is to try and say, okay, we know that the free will problem in Islamic theology is one of the most protracted problems. So the free will problem is sometimes known as theological fatalism or theological determinism. And what that means is, okay, if God knows beforehand what we're going to do, to what extent are we genuinely and truly free? So either we are genuinely and truly free, or God doesn't. We have to constrain God's knowledge or power. So something has to, or God has maximal knowledge and power, or we're not absolutely free. So something's got to give. And that's the conundrum Muslim scholars from the beginning of the 2nd century, in fact, probably even earlier, were contending with. And so my chapter explores a way of trying to understand and talk about the divine that admits of a contradiction, a logical contradiction. And a logical contradiction is just generally a statement of the form affirming something, so something is the case, but then at the same time denying it, so something is not the case. And symbolically, I hope you can see the slide. So symbolically, you can see P and not P. So you affirm a statement and you deny the affirmation of that statement at the same time. So in my chapter, I explore, can the conundrum of God and free will be solved by embracing the conjunction of God's knowledge and power and human free will? That conjunction, embracing that as a contradiction, would that be something acceptable in the theology, or should that be a direction that we can explore when it comes to thinking, talking, and discoursing about the divine? So essentially, that's the case study of my chapter. Okay, so why the reason for this topic? Well, I guess I want to explore how a theology that allows contradiction as exceptions, or that entertains contradictions as a possibility, how might that look? So if we were to set it out, what would be the implications? What would be the contours? What would be the axioms of that theology? So I want to look at that, and especially if we're looking at divine attributes and divine actions, how would a theology that allows for contradictory, or gluts is just another term for a contradiction. So what would that theology look like? So that's what I want to explore, but through a case study. And the case study, as I mentioned, I'm exploring is divine free will and divine knowledge. The other reason, I guess, there are lots of reasons, but just I'm just mentioning two. The other reason, I guess, is I want to carve out of space, just like other people are doing as well, a couple of other people. I want to try and carve out a space where logic and the divine, the intersection between the two, what spills out from that intersection. So if we were to apply logic to the divine, whichever system of logic, because anyone who perhaps has a background in philosophy or in logic, or even in computer science, will know that there are different models of logic. So what would that look like if logical analysis was applied to the divine? What would be the implications of that? So I guess one is explorative and speculative, you could say, and the other is to sort of see what kind of space then we can make for a logical relation between a logical application to studying the divine. So what's the relevance then for the community, before I go on to talk about what the actual problem is and what solution I'm proposing in a bit more detail? So how would this contradictory type theology, this Glut-Theoretic theology, how will that be relevant for the community, whether that's an academic community or just our general community? Well, I guess one significance may be to reconceptualize the divine from sort of mere neat and binary categories or paraphrases. You see, much of the theology that Muslims are either study or are aware of is either theology that is very like rationalist and scholastic, where you use reason and dialectic and argumentation and so on, and use logic as well. And this is the science of ilmul kalam, or the science of rational theology or scholastic theology, however you want to translate that. And then the other is what's known as traditionalist theology, theology that is led more by scripture, but not led by sort of principles of scholastic theology like reason and logic. So scriptural theology and rational theology are sort of the two main methods by which theology is done and learned. And these theologies aim for what we call a consistentizing project, i.e. they're trying to make everything cohere nicely in such a way where you eliminate any kind of paradox or contradiction. So their project is to be consistent. So this kind of approach, a theology that embraces contradiction, would be a kind of move away from or reconceptualization of this kind of theology that is consistentizing, that's aiming to just cohere and eliminate any logical contradiction. So there's a reconceptualization of the divine then, from that kind of traditional way of theological framing. Another significance could be that, you know, internalizing awe of Allah Azza wa Jalla through surrendering to paradox and mystery. Of course, contradiction is stronger than paradox if you don't want to take them in the same way, but you're surrendering to something which you're just submitting and saying there is no, you know, it's not a way from, I cannot understand the divine by merely, I have to embrace the divine. As part of the divine truth is to embrace contradiction. Part of the divine truth is to embrace paradox or mystery or ineffability, which I'm not talking about ineffability today. Ineffability is that God is just beyond any, is just not knowable in any sense. So there's a significant way of internalizing submission to God in a way that one surrenders to God being just, you know, discursively beyond any kind of discursive activity. Another significance could be to acknowledge that theology, as I mentioned, may not always be consistent. We have to have humility and accept that there may be inconsistent elements in the theology, and that doesn't make the theology false. That just means, you know, I cannot make it logically cohere. I cannot make it logically cohere. But if we embrace a logic that allows contradiction, then in effect, and this is sort of the last point, we can't be accused of being irrational, because there's no violation of logic if your logical system allows for contradictions in the first place. So if your logical system allows for both true and false, then if that is a possibility to entertain in the theology, then you're not being illogical, not by that logic anyway. So I guess there is some kind of major radical reconfiguring of one's understanding and conceptualization of the divine. So there is some spillover here that I haven't worked out, I'll be honest. And it's something that I'm sort of working through myself. Okay, so what's the problem specifically, going back to the issue, topic of the paper, and what's the solution? As I mentioned a bit more formally, the problem then is that if God is omniscient, then God knows the future. And if God knows the future, then the future is fixed. If the future is fixed, then we can't do anything other than what we do. If we can't do anything other than what we do, then we are not truly free. And therefore, if God knows everything and is powerful and could do anything, then we're not truly free. But if we, and the converse is that if we are truly free, then something has to give when it comes to divine omniscience or divine power. So if we're truly free, God can't stop us from doing our act. Or if we're really truly free, then something about divine knowledge, there has to be some constraint on divine knowledge. And this is what happens, traditionally. If you look at all the solutions that are given, the traditional solutions to this problem either come from above, as I mentioned, or come from below. The above maneuver is from the God's eye perspective, and the below maneuver is from the creaturely perspective, the human perspective. So the traditional solutions that take the above solution or maneuver, they uphold God's omniscience and power, maximal omniscience, maximal power. So that entails we are not free. So God makes you do what you do, and he knows exactly what you're going to do. And if he knows exactly what you're going to do, and he makes you do what you do, then you're not free. Tough. You're determined. So that's one spectrum of the view. The other spectrum of the view is to go from below. So below is the view that, okay, something's got to give, but we can't let human freedom give. So we're going to uphold human freedom. So humans will do their actions, and that will result in either one, God not knowing exactly what you're going to do, so the future is closed off even to the divine, or God can't stop you from doing what you're doing. He can't intervene, because if he does, it's unjust, and you're not truly free if he intervenes. So you're not morally accountable and so on. So generically, and I'm talking in just generics here, of course, and given the short time. So God's knowledge or his power is limited in one way, to uphold human freedom. So that's the below maneuver. So what I'm proposing then is saying, okay, these above and below maneuvers, why do we need to make these maneuvers? Let's just embrace the divine power and knowledge in its maximal, fullest sense, no modified sense, and let's embrace genuine human free will in its maximum sense, not in a modified sense, and embrace that as a contradiction, meaning that we embrace the conjunction of that we are genuinely free with that we accept the proposition that we are genuinely free in conjunction with the proposition that God is fully knowing and fully powerful, and accept that conjunction, however jarring that might be, however paradoxical it might sound. It doesn't matter if your logic allows it. If your logic allows for the contradiction to be upheld, then so be it. So we would then embrace it as a contradiction. Now, why would we embrace it as a contradiction? Well, a being like the divine and beings like us, small capital B and capital B God, a being like God and being like us, the point at which the two intersect, i.e. the world, so the world being the conduit or the interface between the divine and the creature, that intersection, that occurrence is best explained via a contradiction. So God is fully omniscient and omnipotent, i.e. he knows everything and is all powerful, and we are fully free at the same time. How do we embrace that? We embrace it as a contradiction, i.e. we affirm both in the fullest sense, because that is the case when the divine comes into an interface with creatures. So when the world, which is the interface, the point, the contact point between the divine and the creature, when that occurs, we get a contradiction. I.e., that is the nature itself of that interaction is contradictory. So we embrace it as a contradiction. And that is not irrational, because according to a logical system, we can embrace it. And it's not consistent, that's true. It wouldn't be consistent because you're allowing inconsistency now in your theology. But that's one way to solve a paradox like the omniscience paradox or the foreknowledge paradox, that are we free? Or is God all knowing and all powerful, or which one gives? But the classical solutions, something has to give. We have to give up some aspect or constrain one aspect. But on this view, we're going to take both as it is. So that's the upshot of the paper. Contradictory theology then applied to this case study is to accept human freedom in its fullest sense, and accept divine omniscience and omnipotence in its fullest sense, and embrace that as a contradiction because a different logical system allows you to embrace it, because contradictions will be valid on that logical system. So I'll finish it there, and if there's any comments or questions, it'd be great. I'll just stop sharing if that's necessary.
There are no true contradictions, are there really? For example, a married bachelor cannot exist. So I think the foreknowledge, you call it a foreknowledge paradox. It doesn't have to be, because maybe we just haven't worked out what the problem is yet, what the issue is. I mean, God may have foreknowledge of my absolute free choice of doing something in the future. Knowing doesn't force me to do anything, is one argument that we can say. So I don't see where there is a contradiction, really. And also changing the goalposts in order to allow in contradictions will lead, as you say, possibly to an appeal to mystery. But then which mysteries will we allow to appeal to us? 3 in 1, 1 in 3 is also a mystery according to the Christians. So what privileges their mystery over our mystery will then be the big question we have to ask in determining whether I choose Christianity or whether I choose Islam. So I think this is opening. It's very interesting, I think, as a thought experiment. But I don't think we can kid ourselves and say that there actually are real contradictions out there, such as a triangle that is a square at the same time as being a triangle. That is just illogical by any logic. And if we say, well, this is human logic, but God is God and God is Hakim, well, our system of logic is actually a reflection of divine hikmah. There is no demarcation between human logic and divine logic. There is only one logic. There is only one logical system, actually. We make the demarcation, I think, falsely. So I see lots of issues that will be thrown up by this, quite rightly. I mean, you have to be questioned on this. What's your initial response?
I think you've raised here, I think, a number of technical issues. So the first issue that you raised was whether it genuinely is, whether there are genuine contradictions. Now that will take us down the route of whether we embrace what we call metaphysical dialetheism. So is reality contradictory? So on this view, that on a contradictory theology, we would have to accept that there is at least one metaphysical contradiction, and that would be like the divine attributes would be a real contradiction. So there's contradictions on the level of metaphysics, a reality. Then we have semantic dialetheism. So the idea that contradiction rests at the level of language. So there's no contradiction actually in reality, but rather contradiction rests at the level of our language. The third one is what we call conceptual dialetheism. So conceptual dialetheism is the idea that contradictions don't reside in language, neither do they reside in reality, rather they reside in the constructs of our mind. So contradictions are just something that the mind constructs and configures rather than it being out there. So those are the three main ones. So yeah, this view would entail that at least there is a one metaphysical contradictory reality, and that is God. Now the question is whether the conundrum itself, is a logical conundrum. The thing with the theologians, though, you see, so some of the solutions you gave, that God's knowledge doesn't coerce us, these are valid accounts. But if you look at the traditional solutions, some constraints were made, whichever theological school you look at. So the question is, do we want to constrain a divine attribute? Or do we want to constrain human freedom? The way it looked like in traditional theology, somewhere something had to give to a certain extent, or some modification had to be made. Now, on this view, the simplicity of it would be, you don't have to make any modifications. You don't have to curtail any sense of human freedom in a way that obviates human responsibility. So you embrace it in a full sense. And on the other hand, you don't even have to say, you don't have to accept the Jabariya position where, God compels us. You don't, or the Mu'tazili position that somehow the divine will be unjust if he sort of determines our actions and so on. Or even the sort of middle position of the acquisition theory, where in effect it collapses into determinism. So what this contradictory approach does is that enables you to be robustly embrace the two propositions in their full-blooded sense. And the full-blooded sense is a contradiction. Now, you rightly raise, what if this contradiction becomes promiscuous? What if this contradiction now spreads? This is where we now get into technical realms of logic, where does accepting a contradiction, or explosion we call in logic, we call that the principle of explosion, that if you smuggle logic into your system explodes and then anything goes. Now the Avicennan system, which is the logic adopted by most of the mutakallimun and philosophers, and that's an extension of the Farabian, Aristotelian, Stoic logic. For them, logic has to be both consistent and coherent. So it can never allow for either a contradiction, so you can't violate the law of contradiction, nor the law of the excluded middle. You cannot, your logic has to be watertight, i.e. you can only accept a binary of true or false. Now, according...
Can I ask a question before time runs out?
Sorry, yes, so just very quickly, so remember, and I'll conclude. So the binary, so the system is that it's binary, either true or false. And that's the dominant story of logic until, about 100 years ago, yeah. But there's more to be said on this, yeah.
Okay, Mehmet.
Yeah, just, Saf, admittedly, I do also have a problem with accepting contradiction. I've been pondering this question a lot. Just one suggestion, or maybe something for you to consider, like, would it be possible to see the future as possibilities, and then that's all known? It's bits, it collapses into definite at the present time. It's a bit like the wave function in quantum physics. Yeah. The particle exists in many places, but when a conscious being looks at it, it collapses into a particle and a location. It kind of like qadar is, could be like, or not. Maybe we just get lost in knowledge of Allah, whether he knows, like, what we don't know what Allah knows or what his knowledge entails, but I guess we can appreciate future as all sorts of possibilities, and when we make a choice, those possibilities collapse. So that seems to allow both infinite knowledge of Allah and a very important part of our choice as well.
Yeah, but so, I take this, yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not saying that that some of the traditional responses to diffuse the paradox of foreknowledge and free actions aren't valid solutions, but they come at all of them have come at a modification of the divine attribute, a give or take. So why do that maneuver from above and below? You don't need to make those modifications on either side. You don't need to modify the sense of freedom. You don't need to modify the sense of any of the divine attributes. You accept them in the maximal sense, and you accept freedom in the maximal sense. But that entails, when they're brought into conjunction, that you have to accept it as a contradiction. So I'm just saying this is just, now the logical machinery I can't bring out now in this presentation, but that will take us in the realms of, subclassical logic that aren't classical. They don't follow the logical system developed by Frege, Russell, Whitehead, and Broad, and all these people. So your points are valid. They're possibilities, but they come at the cost of modifying. Can you see? They come at the cost of modifying.
Okay, before I read out some of the comments in the chat box, I just want to add that for me as well, not being into logic at all, but it seems to me that logic itself is limited to answer you try and solve this conundrum logically. So there we are. For me, it seems that logic is too limited to be able to solve this.
Yeah, this is a view that not any logical system can capture, but that will take you to the doctrine of divine ineffability. So that has certain assumptions that not even any language or logical system can capture God. But you see, the traditional scholars wouldn't accept that, because you can talk about God because God has talked about himself. Can you see? So there is something to describe God about. But what this logical system does, it just opens up the space of possibilities from just a binary of true and false.
Thank you. There's some comments probably similar to my comment here, but it says Ghazali makes a beautiful formulation. When the intellect contradicts the narration, the intellect is taken as the basis and the narration as is interpreted.
For sure, in the Qanun al-Ta'wil, he says that, but we'll have to see what application are we having here. What I would say, Ghazali's first posture would be in the Qanun al-Ta'wil is, you don't have to answer this question. You don't have to, because omniscience in knowledge is not anything that we can attain. We'd have to know everything. So yeah, that's a route to take. I'm just exploring that if we want to avoid these kind of logical contradictions, that here's a solution that embraces it. And where does it take us? Yeah, some of the things that Colin mentioned open up, and that has to be worked out for sure. For sure.
More comments here. Like Dr. Turner, I do not see the fact that God knows our choices, how this is going to limit our freedom in choosing.
Sorry, if God doesn't know what you're going to do.
Like Dr. Turner, I do not see the fact that God knows our choices, how this is going to limit our freedom in choosing.
Oh, right. So because of the argument that I set out in the PowerPoint presentation isn't the full-blooded argument, so the question is, can you make God's knowledge false? That's the point, through your free choice. If you do, then there's an issue here, because the divine can't have false, you can't suddenly, you make his knowledge false, can you see, by your actions. So you can't have that entailment, and none of the scholars wanting to embrace that. And in the paper, I mentioned a quote from Razi and others that if you're going to go down that route, where the creature can impact the divine's knowledge and make it false, then you're landing in a bit of dangerous territory. So the logical argument they saw was that you didn't want creaturely power. Creature couldn't have power over the divine in any way.
Another comment, why is freedom the base for discussion? Why choose that as the basis?
Oh, because that was the way it's been construed theologically. So the Muslims inherited the discussion from antiquity, and that's how they framed it, that in order for you to have meaningful choice, in order for you to have accountability, your choices must be morally significant. And your choices can only be morally significant if you could choose otherwise. What they call istita'a. You have the ability to do the contrary. So if you don't have the ability to do the contrary, then you don't have meaningful free choice, and then God can't make you accountable and so on. So that was the context. Yeah.
You might have to repeat yourself. Yeah, I think it says human freedom is not like God's freedom. God has given man a certain area of freedom out of his grace in order to impose responsibility.
For sure, for sure. But that's what every scholar acknowledged. But here the issue isn't the dimension of the kind of freedom we have. That's not what's issue. The issue is, does the type of freedom that we've been given, however limited, if meaningful freedom, can that be consistent with divine foreknowledge? That's the conundrum for them. Of course, our freedom is limited. Yeah.
Mr. Dr. Blood-Ansari is comment. Does this open a door to critical theorists who argue for the contradiction of sex assigned at birth, the contradiction of binary of male and female? Can this down the road open the road to live in contradiction as an exercise of free will?
Only if you accept a contradiction blows up your logical system. If you accept that one contradiction blows up your entire logical system, like what Ibn Sina believed, that if you smuggle in just one contradiction, you've now lapsed into trivialism. Everything becomes true. But on this view, on this logical system, not everything is true, and not every contradiction is accepted. Only what is motivated by the theology. If your theology has a motivation to embrace the contradiction, then your logic won't prevent it. That's all.
Okay, I think I must have missed it. There's another comment. The basis should be linked to hereafter. It's about accountability. That's the main concern of humans.
Yeah, so that's the issue, isn't it? So if your freedom is not morally significant, but then God punishes you for your actions, some theological groups looked at that and thought, well, my freedom will be meaningless then, my free choice, if I am punished for actions that I didn't freely do.